Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. It's time to take your questions, and I've got a bunch coming all from the Patreon. The first few are from Jimmy Carter. His first question is, do you believe that populism and jingoistic behavior will be the central topic of the next federal election cycle? Difficult to say this far out because I don't think it's going to be for at least another year or two. The deal with the NDP seems to be stable. And nobody's in a real rush to go to a federal election right now, despite some of the op-eds you've read over the course of the summer. There's just no real appetite for it right now, particularly with the problems that are going on around with wait times and passports and immigration backlogged and so on and so on. So I think the government is going to want to focus energies on dealing with that before they even contemplate another election, which could be what the next election is fought over. I mean, there's a narrative going on right now about how apparently this government can't do the very basics. I think that needs a little more nuance personally, but that could be the narrative. It could be about collapsing healthcare because premiers have been doing the absolute minimum and have made the situation worse, particularly with COVID. And so that could be something because that always seems to wind up being a federal problem, even though it's the premiers who are actually responsible. So those could be the things, but the sign of the times is that populist rhetoric is certainly in the discourse. So that could also be a part of it, but it's hard to say. It's a little too far out. But I guess we'll just kind of keep our eye on that. Jimmy's second question is, in a country where people, regardless of political affiliation or economic status, are not seeking out or filling out low-paying jobs, and in certain sectors, how do political parties who focus on anti-immigration and xenophobic behavior balance that out with the need for Canada to have a robust foreign workers program? The tried and true method that has tended to be what they've gone for are kind of good immigrants and bad immigrants. And the Conservatives in the previous government tried to play this against one another, particularly in trying to bring in certain ethnocultural communities, particularly those with strong social conservative values. They would kind of play them against a lot of asylum seekers and people for whom they accused of jumping the queue, even though there is no actual queue in refugee processes, it's a process. But that was kind of how they managed that previously, was to try and create different types of newcomers. So I would imagine it would be something fairly similar to that. There will be different nuances to it, but that I think is going to be how it kind of plays off. We like immigrants from this part of the world, less so from this other part of the world, and that tends to be how they tend to play these things. Jimmy's final question is there any way to incentivize jobs in the service and tourist industry without wreaking havoc on their businesses, i.e. raising minimum wages, causing established prices to rise for already thin profit margins to go down, in a time when inflation and the rising cost of rent and personal goods renders the need for people to find higher paying jobs, not as a choice but as a necessity? Not being an economist, but I don't think you're going to be able to really get away without raising wages, and that is going to cause other prices to rise. But I don't personally see any other way around it. I don't think these are particularly jobs that we're going to necessarily fill with a lot of temporary foreign workers. It just doesn't... not with that kind of seasonal work. I wouldn't imagine, but that could be the case. I don't see them getting away with not raising wages at this point. There is something to be said about the fact that if you can't afford to pay your workers, then you shouldn't be in business, because that's capitalism, actually. So I don't see the government. I mean, they're providing help to the tourist sector. A lot of that is in the form of loans, things like that. But I don't see them mandating some kind of special break on minimum wage or anything like that, just because of the tourist sector. That is also largely provincially controlled anyway, minimum wages. So I think market forces might have a lot to do here. But again, I'm not an economist, so something to at least think about when we are talking to an economist. So maybe I'll do that in a future video. We'll see. All right, and our last question comes from KR Mar, who asks, I have a question about politicians who are imprisoned. There's a lot of info about American politics and the fact that Trump could be elected president even if he was actively in prison. What are the rules/standards for Canadian federal members of parliament related to previous imprisonment and or current imprisonment? Just first of all, with the Trump thing, I think there are certain federal convictions in the U.S. which disqualify you from holding federal office. Double check that, but that is my understanding. There are a lot more restrictions on people with criminal records being able to vote or run for office in the U.S. Less so that in Canada. We used to have restrictions on prisoners voting. The Supreme Court struck that down in the post-charter era. So that is a thing here in Canada, unlike in the US. As for someone who's running for office who is imprisoned, I think it's almost entirely impossible, just given the way they can't campaign, really. And it would be difficult for surrogates, I think, to kind of do that work on their behalf. For sitting members of parliament, there are rules around when they can be disqualified. One of them has to do with a serious criminal conviction. But also, if they are currently imprisoned and they can't take their seat in the House of Commons, the House can declare it vacant and run a by-election. Or likewise, if someone is sent to prison, the House can again declare that seat vacant on a majority vote. And that seat will be declared vacant. A by-election would have to be called. So those are kind of how that works. There was, generally though, if it's a sitting MP or senator for whom a criminal conviction is recorded, they tend to resign before the seat is declared vacant in order to basically maintain a shred of dignity, and if they've been serving long enough, to preserve their pension. Yeah, that's kind of how it would work. I don't think there's quite an appetite in Canada for electing someone who is currently in prison. I don't think there are any restrictions for someone who has a criminal record. But that would be, again, an internal party matter. And most likely that person would have a difficult time getting past the party's internal green light process, depending on, obviously, what the conviction was, how recent it was, so on and so on. But that would generally be how that plays out, would be during the nomination stage. And the party would likely, in their vetting process, say, no, I think this is too much of a risk. to reflect badly on the party or to damage the party brand, so on and so on. So I think that's where that's likely to be the collision point. So yeah, there are not a lot of formal restrictions, but most of them are informal and kind of normative in the process, and I think that's where that lies. And that's everything for this week. Thanks for all your questions. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.